Thank you, gang. Thanks to Adrian for doing all of the logistics and to Pete for setting me up here technologically. Thanks to all of you for coming and to all the workers who made this event possible. August 28th, 1963 began inauspiciously. Reporters had been promised a major protest, yet they were the only people on the National Mall in Washington. Turning to Bayard Rustin, the event's organizer, the reporters asked, "Where are the people?" Annoyed and wondering to himself whether anyone would show up, Rustin whipped out a document, glanced at his pocket watch, and said smoothly, "It's all coming according to schedule." He would later confess that he was looking at a blank piece of paper. Within hours, the mall would be occupied by some 200,000 people, 40,000 of them union members. That protest was called the March on Washington for Jobs and Freedom. Rustin, the strategic mastermind behind the protest, was assistant to A. Philip Randolph, president of the Brotherhood of Sweeping Car Porters and the Negro American Labor Council, or NALC. NALC was an independent Black labor organization formed in 1959 to desegregate the labor movement. Randolph hired Rustin to plan the march, and the NALC handled the finances for the event. Indeed, the March on Washington was led and organized as much by Black trade unionists as it was by Dr. Martin Luther King Jr.'s own Southern Christian Leadership Conference. Within the world of organized labor, the march capped an escalating standoff between NALC, the NAACP, the International Ladies Garment Workers Union, or ILG, and the National Labor Federation, AFL-CIO. The conflict emerged out of the ILG's practice of segregating Black and Puerto Rican members into the worst jobs, and it evolved into the AFL's unwillingness to punish local and state affiliates for excluding Black people from meetings, membership, and elected office. The widespread persistence of Jim Crow unionism, combined with accelerating deindustrialization, created a crisis of unemployment in the Black community. This was corroborated by a series of blockbuster reports from the U.S. Commission on Civil Rights, the New York City Youth Board, and others, all with the same message: that racial segregation in the labor movement concentrated Black people in menial occupations and the growing ranks of the unemployed. Accordingly, in the years just prior to the march, now called to account AFL-CIO President George Meany for not doing enough to curb employment discrimination. When Randolph, Dr. King, and others conveyed the marchers' demands to President John F. Kennedy in August 1963, several of those demands centered on fair employment. The March on Washington for Jobs and Freedom generated such immense pressure on the labor movement that in the months following, the AFL-CIO and its affiliates agreed to do more to fight racial discrimination in their ranks. Even the state federations of Alabama and Mississippi lobbied in favor of the Civil Rights Bill making its way through Congress and resisted attempts by Senate Dixiecrats and Republicans to dilute the legislation. By June 1964, the so-called Negro Labor Alliance was confident enough to threaten a national one-day strike on the anniversary of the march if the Senate blocked the bill's passage. The Senate wouldn't pass the Civil Rights Act that same month. Although the historical evidence suggests that Black labor activists pushed for their own inclusion in American unions, the story of interracial solidarity, as most scholars tell it, centers on white activists. White-led unions were either racially exclusionary toward Black people, thereby undermining interracial solidarity, or racially inclusive, thereby fostering it. This either-or approach, however, suffers from at least two limitations in the U.S. context. First, scholars tend to look for interracial solidarity in unions, even though Black workers in the United States were unlikely to be union members in the first half of the 20th century. By comparison, independent Black labor organizations, those unaffiliated with sanctioned worker federations, receive much less attention. Second, and as a consequence of the preoccupation with unions, African Americans typically show up as minor or passive actors in U.S. labor history. We know much less about instances in which Black people played the leading role. My new book, Freedom Train, challenges scholars and activists to think differently about the cause of interracial labor solidarity, which I define here as a vision of working-class comradeship based on the principles of inclusive membership, representative leadership, and the struggle for economic and racial justice. If we are interested in illuminating the role of Black workers, then we must shift our focus from unions, where white workers have historically predominated, to what we might call subaltern organizations, where Black workers were the leading figures. Widening our aperture in this way allows us to ask a different question. What conditions within the Black community advance the cause of interracial labor solidarity? I ask this question because Black people were, and indeed saw themselves as, the vanguard of that struggle. Though progressive whites assisted, it was Black workers themselves who continually pressed for their own inclusion in white-led unions. Indeed, Black labor activists in the middle of the 20th century referred to themselves as the Freedom Train, hearkening back to the Underground Railroad that smuggled the enslaved to freedom. The energy that propelled the Freedom Train forward was the conflict and consensus among organizations within Black civil society. I call this back and forth Black politics. If a key task of this book is to demonstrate the agency of Black people, then I should point out that the story I tell is slightly different from other accounts with the same goal. This is not only a story of unified collective struggle, but also one of messiness, internal division, intrigue, and betrayal. I want to suggest that such fractiousness does not diminish Black agency. If anything, evidence of internal conflict enhances it. That is, Black folk were invested enough in the cause of interracial labor solidarity to debate the correct course of action, and sometimes form a united front. Both the consensus and conflict in Black civil society add important details to the claim that Black people were agents of their own liberation. Indeed, as I seek to demonstrate, an unintended consequence of these internal debates was tactical innovation, and the successive shifts in tactics applied ever greater pressure upon the state and organized labor to integrate unions. This may seem counterintuitive to some. It is not uncommon for activists to deflect charges of racism, sexual harassment, and homophobia in social movement spaces as divisive, destructive, and ultimately disloyal. The story of Black labor activists provides an important counter to that argument, for it was precisely their ability to navigate conflict in their own organizations and in the wider movement that forced white labor leaders to confront the problem of the color line. The supposed weakness of internal division was in fact a strength. The rent originated with the so-called right and left wings of Assembly District 21 of the Socialist Party in Harlem. Thereafter, the different factions of Black civil society split and consolidated to form successive and sometimes competing independent Black labor organizations. Chief among these were the centrist faction led historically by A. Philip Randolph on the one hand, and on the other, the left faction, led by successive cadres like Cyril Briggs of the African Blood Brotherhood, John P. Davis and Thelma Dale of the National Negro Congress, Vicki Garvin and Ernest Thompson of the National Negro Labor Council, and the broken remnants of these struggles would come together briefly in the Negro American Labor Council. By left, I refer to those organizations that were internationalist in orientation, whether in their commitment to the international communist movement or Black anti-colonial politics. The left faction condemned capitalism as a system of economic, racial, and colonial domination, and looked with suspicion upon organized labor as class collaborationist and racist. The left were popular with African-American workers because of their armed defense of the Black community during the Tulsa race riots of 1921, their legal defense of the Scottsboro Boys and Angelo Herndon in the 1930s, and the organization of Black workers into industrial unions also in the 1930s. The centrist faction, by contrast, oriented toward the United States primarily, and were critical of capital only insofar as it excluded Black people from the workforce. Centrists were more comfortable than their counterparts in engaging with the bureaucracy of organized labor. They oscillated between liberal and progressive politics, sometimes working with the left and other times participating in outright red baiting. The centrists earned the support of African-American workers with two marquee achievements: the establishment of the Brotherhood of Sleeping Car Porters, which was the country's only Black-led AFL International Union, and the 1941 March on Washington movement, which, though postponed, successfully pressured Franklin Delano Roosevelt into outlawing segregation in the defense industry and unions with Executive Order 8802. The analytic impulse to highlight the agency of Black people in the cause of interracial labor solidarity is anchored in a Du Boisian approach. Such an approach centers the agency and lived experience of subaltern actors within the context of racialized modernity. Thus, in his magisterial Black Reconstruction in America, Du Bois argued that the turning point in the U.S. Civil War was the defection of the enslaved from the South to the North, which increased the size of the Union Army and crippled the Confederate Army's supply lines. The implications of Black Reconstruction are many, but there are two interrelated claims that bear special mention here. First, Black people were agents of their own liberation. As much as they relied upon the moral courage of white allies in the abolition movement, Black folk also organized themselves and were the drivers of Reconstruction. Second, we must look beyond elites to subaltern voices for the sources of social change. By centering the experience and activism of women, workers, people of color, and other marginalized groups, we stand to achieve a fuller picture of our collective history. This ethic, what we might call the subaltern imperative, was central to Du Bois's intellectual and political project. In recent years, we have witnessed renewed interest in Du Bois's work in sociology, led by Alden Morris. Early in Morris's career, sociologists held that the success of the civil rights movement in the 1960s was due mainly to the support of white allies like Presidents Johnson and Kennedy, the resulting fracture in a power structure that had once turned a blind eye to Black suffering. Breaking with this school of thought, Morris demonstrated that, in fact, the rapid spread of the civil rights movement across the South was due to the institution of the Black church, which formed the crucial node in local clusters of civil rights. It was, once again, the internal resources of the Black community, not the external support of sympathetic whites, that fueled the cause of Black liberation. Several other sociologists have followed in Morris's footsteps, and my work is another in this tradition. Where this book differs theoretically from the aforementioned sociologists is in conceiving of the subaltern not as a group, but as a terrain of struggle, what some sociologists call a field. Often, when we elevate subaltern voices, we follow the career of one social movement, one social class or organization over time. The cause of interracial labor solidarity from 1917 to the 1963 March on Washington, by contrast, is a story of successive battles among organizations with competing political dispositions in the same social space, which I refer to here as Black labor. The evidentiary basis for this research is a content analysis of speeches, correspondence, minutes, and state surveillance records from 4 archives: the Library of Congress, the Schomburg Center for Research in Black Culture, the Walter Reuther Library, and the Du Bois Library, UMass Amherst. I've chosen to study national organizations instead of 1 or 2 local unions, as professional historians and sociologists often do, for 3 reasons. To begin, scholars have already done a magnificent job of sharing the histories of local struggles to integrate the labor movement. A small but critical body of scholarship has highlighted individual cases of Black worker self-organizing, for example, in the work of Robin Kelly, Korstadt, Honey, and Cole. By comparison, we know much less about Black efforts to nationalize that struggle. Next, my research on independent Black labor organizations reveals that local and national struggles were not mutually exclusive. For instance, as the political scientist Michael Goldfield writes, the National Negro Congress supplied the organizers who recruited Black workers into the Steelworkers Union in places like Pittsburgh, Birmingham, Chicago, and Gary. Third, I did not want to give the impression that Black labor's efforts were small exceptions to the larger rule that white people were the leading advocates of interracial solidarity. As we will see, Black activists established extensive mass organizations with local councils in every region of the country. That is the story that I believe has yet to be told. In the interest of time, I will present data on only two independent Black labor organizations: the National Negro Congress, in which the centrist and left factions coexisted peacefully until 1940, and the 1941 March on Washington movement, into which A. Philip Randolph led the centrists after breaking with the Congress. The inaugural meeting of the National Negro Congress began on a freezing February day in 1936. 800 delegates from 28 states converged on the 8th Regiment Armory in Chicago's Bronzeville neighborhood. The delegates came from across the ideological spectrum. Speaking for the left were Harlem Communist Party head James Ford and Howard University professor Ralph Bunche. The Reverend Adam Clayton Powell Jr. spoke on behalf of the Black clergy. Lester Granger promoted the National Urban League's plan for labor education among Black workers. So star-studded was the lineup that one delegate said, "I had never seen so many big shots together in my life." Nor was this lost on the city's Black residents. Those who could not fit inside the armory huddled in their thousands around outdoor loudspeakers to hear what their leaders had to say. Although he was ill and could not attend the inaugural meeting, A. Philip Randolph was determined to provide organizational direction to the Congress. Charles Wesley Burton, who had persuaded the Union leader to become the NNC's first president, read Randolph's speech aloud. Randolph sought to give credit to previous attempts at Black unification, while simultaneously suggesting that the times called for a new approach. He said that although the fight for civil and political liberties had been brilliantly waged by the NAACP and the Communist International Labor Defense, quote, "the gravity and complexity of the problems accentuated and widened by the evil of fascist trends in America demands that new tactics and strategy be employed to meet the situation. The maneuvering and disposing of the forces of Negro peoples against their enemies can only be effectively worked out through the tactics and strategy of the United Front." Moreover, Randolph insisted that Black people must lead the United Front. In this, he argued for a break with the Black middle class, who had grown accustomed to leaning on enlightened whites for support, and in doing so failed to challenge the system of white supremacy. He said, quote, "the Negro people should not place their problems for solution down at the feet of their white sympathetic allies, which has been and is the common fashion of the old school Negro leadership. For, in the final analysis, the salvation of the Negro, like the workers, must come from within." After several such speeches, the Congress voted on and passed a series of resolutions that underlined the meeting's focus on organizing the Black working class. These resolutions provide evidence that the delegates intended to establish a mass organization that could press for interracial solidarity in the wider labor movement. Noting that discrimination is practiced against Negro workers in the trade unions, thus compelling these workers to remain unorganized and work for lower standards, the Congress resolved to establish labor committees for the special purpose of organizing the unorganized, as well as a governing trade union committee to manage the process. Are you okay? All right. The combined infrastructure would be part of a nationwide drive to organize Negro workers, with a focus on key industries in which Black people predominated. In this, the NNC came out publicly in support of industrial unionism, which sought to move beyond organizing workers narrowly by trades, from which Black workers were excluded anyway, to organizing entire industries, wall to wall, regardless of scale. The delegates also emphasized the role of Black women to working class struggle. The NNC prefigured what we today call intersectionality by observing that, quote, the Negro women of America are subjected to threefold exploitation as women, as workers, and as Negroes, and are forced through discrimination into the most menial labor under the worst conditions without organizational protection. Thus, the NNC was unique, not only because of the breadth of the coalition that came together, but also because the coalition looked to the Black worker to lead the liberation of the race. Previously, it had been middle-class organizations that advocated on behalf of African Americans, and the most illustrious of these were the NAACP and the Urban League. At the NNC, by contrast, each speech and resolution focused on the plight of Black working women and men, their exclusion from the ranks of organized labor, and the urgency of interracial solidarity to meet the continuing deprivation of the Great Depression. On June 10, 1936, roughly 4 months after the inaugural Congress, NNC national organizer John P. Davis began executing the Congress's ambitious campaign to desegregate the labor movement. His first move was to share his plan to organize Black steelworkers with the AFL's Committee for Industrial Organization. It just so happened that John Brophy, director of the AFL Industrial Committee, was also thinking of collaborating with the NNC. In a letter dated June 11, 1936, Brophy asked an AFL field rep to arrange a visit of the NNC leadership to the Midwest because, quote, their goodwill is very important in both the steel and auto organizing campaigns that are in prospect, end quote. 1 week later in Cleveland, Davis buttonholed Van Bittner of the Steelworkers Organizing Committee, or SWOC, and persuaded him to start a campaign that would organize 85,000 Black workers. Davis argued that such a step was necessary to avoid the racial divisions that led to the defeat of the steel strikes in 1919. Eventually, Bittner asked Davis to do a careful survey of Black trade unionists in the Great Lakes area with the goal of putting them on staff as SWOC organizers. Davis recommended 3 workers at the outset: Henry Johnson, Eleanor Rye, and Leonidas McDonald, to organize the Chicago Northwest Indiana Steel Corridor. Rye, McDonald, and Johnson, the so-called triumvirate, succeeded beyond even Davis's wildest dreams. By early 1937, they had organized 115 separate SWAT locals in Chicago and Gary, Indiana alone. In the spring, they would go on to unionize steelworkers in Ohio, Pennsylvania, and Alabama. In addition to inaugurating the steel campaign, Davis traveled to Detroit and helped form the Black nucleus of the United Auto Workers, or UAW. In a retrospective interview, local NNC leader C. LeBron Simmons recalled bringing together a group of activists who included James Walker, Paul Kirk, Vera Vandenberg, and perhaps most famously, Coleman Young, who would go on to be mayor of Detroit. Noting that, quote, the National Negro Congress was instrumental in helping to organize the CIO, end quote, Simmons went as far as to say that the UAW, quote, had been the forebears of the Union. Of the National Negro Congress had been the forebears of the Union. Indeed, it was a group of militant Black unionists from the Detroit NNC who orchestrated the final push to organize the Ford Motor Company in 1941. The youth arm of the NNC, the Southern Negro Youth Congress, or SNCC, organized the tobacco workforce in Richmond, Virginia, a majority of whom were Black women. In 1937, SNCC staged the first sit-down strike ever held in Virginia. As a result, 350 Black workers at the Carrington and Michaud tobacco factory won a 33% wage increase. SNCC organized a second strike that yielded a 20% wage increase for 468 workers, this time at Iron Bond and Company. The speed and reach of the campaign outstripped SNCC's capacity to keep up. Membership in both unionized plants was at 100%. In less than 1 month, NNCE's organizers had formed 4 local unions, all with an entirely volunteer staff. The white-led labor movement was stingy, if not hostile, to this effort, however. When the striking workers went to the AFL and newfound Congress of Industrial Organizations, or CIO, to ask for help, CIO staff said that they did not have a tobacco union in place to organize them, while the AFL's racist Tobacco Workers International Union, TWIU, refused to let the Black workers affiliate. The workers thus founded their own independent union, the Tobacco Stemmers and Laborers Union, or TSLU. It was only after the successful strike wave that the big labor federations responded. For example, the AFL's TWIU rushed to claim the members of the TSLU, but the workers and organizers refused. From that point forward, the AFL attempted to sink the new union through a vicious combination of race and red baiting. Undaunted, TSLU would go on to lay the groundwork for organizing the even larger North Carolina tobacco workforce. The NNC also led the fight to organize Chicago's giant meatpacking industry. Inspired by the Steel Campaign, a group of packing house workers asked SWAC to charter a similar organization called the Packing House Workers Organizing Committee, or PWOC. In the spring of 1937, SWAC paid their organizer, Hank Johnson, to work on the campaign based on the earlier agreement with Davis and the NNC. In all, PWOC and the NNC organized a total of 14 local unions in a matter of 2 years. Black workers were presidents of 9. The NNC's unprecedented organizing drive would slow dramatically, however, in 1950. From the beginning, Randolph had been convinced that the success of the NNC would depend on maintaining a united front. No one organization should control the Congress, he warned, for Black civil society would only unify around the broadest possible program. Randolph never wavered from this position and, in fact, defended the Congress from repeated charges that it was a front for other organizations. Accordingly, when he arrived at the 1940 NNC annual meeting in Washington to find it enthralled to the Communist Party and the CIO, Randolph felt blindsided. The backdrop to this moment was the Second World War. In 1939, Joseph Stalin and Adolf Hitler signed the Nazi-Soviet Non-Aggression Pact, agreeing not to fight each other in the ever-widening European theater. After years of anti-fascist organizing, the Communist Party in the United States now performed a shocking about-face. They rallied around the slogan, "The Yanks are not coming," and criticized the Roosevelt administration for preparing the American public to go to war. Meanwhile, Labor's Nonpartisan League, or LNPL, which had been the New Deal's electoral machine inside the white-led labor movement, was also aligning with the communists, though for their own reasons. CIO President John L. Lewis, by that point, had turned the LNPL into an advocacy group for his own ideological convictions, and Lewis was a lifelong Republican. In line with his party, Lewis favored isolationism in foreign affairs and thus opposed America's entrance into the war. Due to their roots in the Harlem left and their success in organizing industrial workers, the overwhelming majority of delegates to the 1940 National Negro Congress were CIO and party members, and it showed. The meeting took place at the U.S. Department of Labor in Washington, the very heart of the New Deal apparatus, but it was overwhelmingly anti-Roosevelt. For example, the NNC's honorary guest was John L. Lewis. Randolph found himself awkwardly attending Lewis and giving him a plaque for his support of Black workers. When the Congress opened, it was not Randolph or Davis, the NNC's leading officers, who welcomed delegates, but John L. Lewis. And so, when Randolph, the leading Black trade unionist in America, took to the podium, speaking second at his own meeting to a white man, he knew that there would be trouble. In his speech titled "The World Crisis and the Negro People Today," Randolph confessed, "Personally, I would not be a member of the Negro Congress or any other organization which was a communist front or transmission belt, not only because I reject the communist program, but because I wouldn't be part of any organization which hypocritically professed one thing and did another, Since the Communist Party of America stems from Communist Russia, its policies and program tactics and strategy are as fitful, changeful, and unpredictable as the foreign policy and line of Moscow. The Communist Party is not primarily or fundamentally concerned about the Negro or labor in America, but with the consolidation of the foreign position of the Soviet Union in world politics. Howard University professor Ralph Bunche, who had organized the conference with Davis, would later recount that as Randolph spoke, the audience dwindled precipitously from 1,700 people to around one-third that size. Randolph's remarks were so incendiary, in fact, that Davis felt the need to respond. He stayed up all night rewriting the report he was meant to give the following evening. Just before midnight on Saturday, April 27, Davis climbed the platform and said, quote, "I have visited the Soviet Union. I have talked to the Soviet people. I know of their deep friendship and aid to all oppressed peoples. And on the basis of that experience and knowledge, which is shared by thousands of people, I firmly believe that the American Negro people will refuse to fall victims to anti-Soviet adventures, will refuse to join American or world imperialism in any attack against the Soviet people." Davis thus articulated for the record what many others were saying informally on the floor of the Congress, namely that if the United States were to go to war against the Soviet Union, African Americans would not fight. The back and forth between the centrist and left factions of the NNC, a conflict that had been latent since its founding, culminated in the Resolutions Committee meeting on Sunday morning, April 28th. The committee proposed resolutions opposing America's entrance into the Second World War and in support of labor's nonpartisan league. When the NNC adopted the resolution, Randolph said that the organization had reached a point in its development when it at last departed from the strategy of articulating minimum demands upon which all of Black civil society could agree. He disclosed that he himself disagreed with some of the principles just adopted, and then he said, quote, "For these reasons, it is impossible for me to continue as president of the Congress. Whenever the Congress is tied up too closely with any organization, it loses its mass character. We have received donations from the Communist Party, and that is not a healthy condition. The Congress will be responsible to the organization from which it gets its money. For these reasons, I have concluded that I can no longer serve." Randolph's next act would be shaped as much by the Second World War as his last one. For as if his colleagues' anti-war position pushed him out of the NNC, then racial discrimination in the defense industry pulled him into a new project, the March on Washington movement, or MOWM. Having met the challenge of the Great Depression with industrial unionism, Black workers confronted a new crisis of unemployment in 1940. The robust economic growth of the war years owed much to the manufacture of munitions, tanks, and airplanes for the war effort. Yet the defense industry refused to hire Black people, and in fact had it as their policy never to do so. Nor was this only a problem with employers, for white-led unions continued to systematically exclude Black people from their ranks. When Black workers in Seattle asked to be considered for employment at a Boeing aircraft plant, an official of the International Association of Machinists Union said, quote, "Labor has been asked to make many sacrifices in this war and has made them gladly. But this sacrifice is too great." To meet this challenge, Randolph invented a new tactic, a mass mobilization in the nation's capital to demand the desegregation of industry, government, and labor. What does this brief history of the National Negro Congress and March on Washington teach us about the dynamics of interracial labor solidarity? The first lesson is that white support was inconsistent. When A. Philip Randolph moved to desegregate the defense industry, as we just saw, unions like the International Association of Machinists stubbornly opposed the campaign. Even white activists who supported the cause of interracial solidarity occasionally did more harm than good. The Communist Party is a good example. The 1939 Nazi-Soviet non-aggression pact led the NNC to adopt an anti-war posture, which in turn prompted Randolph's resignation as president. The second lesson is that Black labor activists pressed for their own inclusion in steel, auto, tobacco, and meatpacking. In the tobacco campaign, for example, the AFL affiliate in Richmond was hostile to the campaign, while the CIO provided minimal support, offering only to bring Black organizers on as volunteer staff. It was Black workers themselves who began and led the strikes that organized the tobacco industry in the former capital of the Confederacy. Thirdly, Black women formed the vanguard of the tobacco workers' campaign in Richmond and were the heart and soul of the Southern Negro Youth Congress. The struggle in Richmond provided the blueprint for a later upsurge in interracial organizing that spawned the legendary Local 22 of the Food, Tobacco, and Agricultural Workers Union, or FTA, in the 1940s. For example, Theodosia Simpson, who helped to organize R.J. Reynolds in North Carolina, had also been a SNCC organizer in her spare time. FTA and the CIO would go on to organize 8,000 workers in Virginia and 20,000 workers in North Carolina, the overwhelming majority of whom were Black women. The fourth lesson is that Black politics, the conflict and consensus between the left and centrist factions of Black civil society, propelled the ongoing struggle for interracial solidarity. When in the 1930s, the NNC adhered to a minimum program upon which all of Black civil society could agree, they organized tens of thousands of Black industrial workers. The ensuing conflict between the centrist and left factions fractured the Congress, but the conflict also broadened the tactical repertoire of Black labor. The factional strife of the 1940 NNC meeting in Washington may have led to Randolph's resignation, but it also led Randolph to invent the March on Washington as a tactic. Theoretically speaking, such factional strife suggests that the so-called subaltern is not one unitary class or movement as existing theory would have it, but rather a field of struggle among actors with competing political dispositions. Moreover, it suggests that conflict need not be an organizational hindrance, but a source of tactical innovation. But a book in the Du Boisian tradition would be incomplete without a discussion of political implication. The story of the NNC suggests that we must rethink what the labor movement is. Unions are not the only groups that workers can form to effect social change. Of the several Black-led groups discussed in this presentation, only two, Randolph's Brotherhood of Sleeping Car Porters and the Tobacco Stemmers and Laborers, were unions. And yet, the combined pressure of these organizations, directed by the NNC, was able to push at least some sectors of the white-led labor movement in the United States toward inclusion. In practice, the contemporary U.S. labor movement consists not only of unions, but also of worker centers, political parties, labor educators, and movement partnerships like that of the Movement for Black Lives and the Fight for 15. There are over 140 million unorganized workers in the United States alone, many of them people of color, in the most precarious sectors of the job market, where worker centers are far more prevalent than unions are. We need all the help we can get, and alternative labor organizations can provide a boost to organizing capacity. But I maintain that unions have a crucial role to play. In Freedom Train, I show how the Brotherhood of Sleeping Car Porters provided vital staffing and resources to organize the 1941 March on Washington. The industrial organizing drives of the late 1930s were made possible by a close working relationship between the National Negro Congress and CIO experiments like the Steelworkers Organizing Committee. A similar undertaking today will require coordination across a new mass movement, particularly in the spaces where the Black freedom struggle intersects with organized labor and where the left meets the ideological center. That has been the pattern of every major upsurge in U.S. labor history. But if the story of interracial solidarity has taught us anything, it is that organized labor will not do what must be done on its own. If we ever revitalize the U.S. labor movement in our lifetime, then we can be certain that the Freedom Train made one more run.
Okay. I'll get us kicked off while everyone else thinks of some questions. Firstly, thank you for an excellent talk. That was really rich. I really enjoyed that. I'd like to ask you a little bit more about one of the key arguments you make around the generative effects of factional debates within the movement. I'm just wondering, what we can potentially draw out from this case about the nature of intra-organizational debates, because in this instance, they're tactically generative, and that can take place in other organizations as well. For example, where you have a debate about tactics, one side goes, we should do this, and you want to make facts on the ground, prove that the tactical innovation was successful, and so on, in order to win a debate. In this case, it takes place outside once Randolph leaves.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, earlier you mentioned, for example, Randolph citing the United Front. So I suppose that what I'm asking is, what can you take from the case to learn? What can you learn? Is there anything you've drawn from it about the nature of factional debate within movements? Because this is something that the left contends with a lot, and it's not always generative. From time to time. So is there something about this case that led it to being generative? Or, I'd just like to know how you're thinking about some of that.
Yeah. So I take that to be a kind of question about like, what are the conditions under which factional debate can be generative, and conditions under which it deteriorates into the kind of like sectarian infighting that is not at all productive. I'm not putting words in your mouth, but so I had two answers to this question. The first is that there were situations in which the factional debate led to one faction recruiting the state, and so the more conservative sectors of the organized labor movement into the fight. And in doing so, led to the political persecution of one faction. And those are instances in which, obviously, factional debate did not lead to productive organizing in any way. In fact, typically, it often led to the left faction folding up under the weight of political persecution, right? So this happened in the 1950s during the McCarthyite era, when A. Philip Randolph aligned with the white-led organized labor movement and coordinated an assault from the state through the Attorney General's office, and also through HUAC, famously the House Committee on Un-American Affairs, right? And the National Negro Labor Council, which was the preeminent independent Black labor organization in the 1950s during the McCarthy era, essentially disbanded because they didn't want to put the leadership or the members through a protracted fight that might lead to their arrest and imprisonment. So they just stayed on, essentially, to live another day. But there were instances in which that factional struggle stopped short of that. So, I think it's important to think about the concept of critical solidarity, where we're all in this mass movement together, but we're not going to pull back and not say that there are racial, occupational, gender dynamics, homophobia in the union, for fear that conversation might lead to a weakening of the union or whatever labor organization you're a part of. And in fact, what I find in this book is that actually facing those issues head on actually led to, as I said, tactical innovation, but also the strengthening of those organizations. So, for example, the challenge of Black women to the leadership of many of these organizations was, you can see it throughout the book. Actually, women are acting up, pushing, what we today call intersectionality, but insisting upon their representation in leadership, insisting that be organized Black women in the workforce. And for the most part, particularly in the 1950s, but also in other eras, they succeeded in making the male leadership not only include Black women in leadership, but also, engage in organizing that targeted sectors of the workforce that were disproportionately Black women. And even though that was not pleasant, there are many moments in the book where you can see the conflict. I mean, there's a particularly interesting fight that happens on the floor of the Negro American Labor Council, which is the organization that organized the March on Washington for Jobs and Freedom, where Black women basically refused to let A. Philip Randolph adjourn the inaugural meeting of the Negro American Labor Council until they changed their constitution on the spot and nominate 2 women to be included in the leadership slate. And it's like they're like fighting on the floor, like, Black women and men are fighting on the floor of the Negro American Labor Council. That's not pleasant. This is not a polite conversation, right? But at the same time, they did not recruit the state into that debate. You know what I mean? They didn't try to squash the other faction. And I think that led to a different kind of outcome. So that, I think, is the sort of the key piece there, right? Can you maintain critical solidarity within your organization, right, without recruiting, let's say, outside or conservative forces, or God forbid, the state, right, to assist you in repressing the other faction? If you can do that, then I think it is generative.
Question from our virtual audience.
Oh, virtual audience, yeah. And then
If we can
yeah.
pivot. Zhen Zhang says, thanks, Cedric. It was a fantastic talk. They're particularly interested in the dynamics between Black labor movements and communists. How did the dynamics within communists and also communists and other actors influence Black labor movements or vice versa? For example, the attitude towards Soviet Union and Sino-Soviet split, different attitudes towards the so-called Negro question in the Comintern, the affinity between Maoism as a non-white Marxism and the Black movement.
Yeah. Wow. Okay. Great. Yes. Briefly. Oh, these notes are crazy. I have CP odd WP lifted. Let's see if I can actually make sense of this. Okay. So look, the Communist Party, particularly in the immediate aftermath of the Bolshevik Revolution, had very funny ideas about what Black workers were willing to do in the international working class revolution to come, right? They believed, because Black workers were the most exploited of the exploited, that they would be the vanguard, literally on the front lines of the militant armed struggle against capital. And, while Black communists were not shy about being involved, I mean, they were really serious cadres, they also were kind of surprised by how little they really understood the situation of Black workers, let's say, in the United States. I mean, they were, because, of course, I mean, we the people in this room know about, just the pervasiveness of Jim Crow, of lynching, and so forth. I mean, the racism in the United States was totalizing, right? And any kind of acting out on the part of Black workers was typically met with violent force, coercion, or death, right? And so it was a life or death matter. And Black workers believed that this was let's say, a premature understanding of the position of the Black worker in the international movement, right? And so for them, I mean, their idea was to do base building, right? Black workers said, listen, we need to like take a step back here. Let's not engage in these sort of like weird debates about doctrine that communists are so fond of, right? Like let's not do this, right? Let's have conversations about like, what is it like to be a Black worker in this country? That's a good starting point, right? What's it like to work at your workplace, right? What things have you gone through? That sort of thing, right? And in fact, what is so interesting about this is that, at least in the United States, which is the case I know best, right? Eventually, the Communist Party, after these sort of like fits and starts of organizing these really horrible, failed sectarian meetings, right, in which like 40 workers showed up, for example, right? They started to listen to their Black cadres. And in fact, they lifted the program of the African Blood Brotherhood, which is sort of like the communist cell in Harlem, right? At that time, and they made it their own. Okay, so we often hear about the ways in which the Communist Party has acted upon Black civil society and has reshaped Black civil society. We don't talk as much about the way that Black civil society impacted or shaped the Communist Party. And so, I focus on moments like that in the book, where communists are actually taking directions from their Black cadres in order to kind of reshape, reframe how they're trying to organize Black working class people. And actually, the National Negro Congress is a result of that, right? They their focus was on organizing Black industrial workers into industrial unions. And it was that kind of program, that agenda, that really kind of reshaped at least the Communist Party's tactics within the United States. I will also say this: we often attribute this kind of united front, kind of like coalitional strategy to the Communist Party. We call it, in this country, we call it the Popular Front, right? But Black cadres organized a United Front conference in Harlem in 1923. Before the Communist Party made that shift. The party made that shift in the early 1930s. For those who know the history,
The book came out in 28.
what was that?
Dimitrof's book came out.
Oh, yeah, right. So late 1920s, early 1930s, that's when the shift happened. A United Front Conference had already been called by Black socialists and communists by 1920. And so, that's sort of my main thing. I mean, I don't really have a kind of systematic, analysis of the ways in which, the international movement impacted, African American worker strategy in the United States and vice versa. But I do try to highlight moments such as these. I hope that answered you.
Brother, I have to agree with Professor Steigman. Just a brilliant talk, and I think that you created more doubt in me than which is a good thing. The other thing, I'm interested in this confluence in the 30s between A. Philip Randolph, H.L. Mitchell, and also Ernesto Galarza. Right.
Oh, wow.
So what we know is that they were all, in solidarity, at least, one as a non-communist, right?
Mhm.
One as a social democrat.
Yeah.
Because if you said you were a communist, you were gonna get deported if you were a Mexican national at the time. And then we have A. Philip Randolph, who all three of them participated in the March on Washington. But the question is that this is only 85 years ago, right? I mean, it's so recent in terms of when we have these conversations that what we see happen to A. Philip Randolph in the reaction from big labor, the AFL-CIO, in pushing them out, eventually happens also to the Sharecroppers Union and also to Ernesto Galarza, because of their organizing strategies. These organizing strategies that were really in confrontation, right? In that internal confrontation, right? Calling out your leadership, right? There's no mystery that Nini wasn't. Now, I guess I shouldn't say this out loud, but I am. That he wasn't a friend of the farm worker labor movement. At the end there in the late 50s, when they defunded and pulled the charter of the National Farm Worker Labor Union, and went with AWOC. And there's also no mystery that is the reason that we have the victories of the 60s by the UFW is because they were built on this tradition of collective action
Yeah.
in the face of no labor law, right? And so I just wanted to see if you see any like confluence between that moment in the 30s that just kind of develops out and
Right.
up to the 60s.
Yeah. It's I think the emergence of the UFW is a really kind of interesting, analog, right? For Mexican labor in particular, right? Because that is also, even though there are certainly there's cross-pollination happening, of course, right? Because you have the Alinskyite kind of like influence from Chicago, and Fred Ross is one of Cesar's mentors, right? And so there are conversations about like how to do community organizing, right? And of course, you do have some of the local knowledge that Filipino workers were bringing into, because they had been unionized, they knew how to strike, and sort of like that kind of like mix, right, of the struggle of Mexican farm workers, of the kind of experience of Filipino labor, of the Alinskyite tradition, and also the backdrop or the prehistory of that moment. But I think that where I stand on this is that even though it's for sure complicated, and there are political influencers, there's also the backdrop of political persecution. It still comes down to worker self-organizing, right? Because in the absence of any collective bargaining law for agricultural workers, right, which still shockingly remains the case today, right? There are only a few states in the United States where there is a collective bargaining law for agricultural workers, right? In the absence of a legal framework, in the absence of integrated unions that welcome Black and brown workers into the ranks, what do we do? Right. And I think Galarza is a good example of that. Though again, there's the communist influence for sure, but I think it comes down to that. So I don't know if that's insightful in any way, but I think that
Absolutely.
This is why it was so surprising to me that when I looked at the literature on interracial solidarity, that the main protagonists of all of these stories, most of these stories, were white people, because what I knew, I mean, I worked for the UFW. What I knew was that actually, like, white labor was not super interested right, in including people, and so the history that you just articulated is, I think, another example of that. Oh, is there another?
Two from virtual. So I'll give you two that way. If there are more questions forthcoming from our virtual audience, or from Nestor and Nestor, you're next. We can make sure that everybody gets the steps of comment. So Bill Balderston asks if you could expand further on organizing by African Americans in earlier labor struggles in the South, particularly in textiles, some closely involving the CP, and how they link to the later struggles in the 30s. And then Howie Winant writes, your work is greatly appreciated. You frequently use the designations of altern to refer to Black masses and extra union organizing. Could you discuss your understanding of this term in the context of U.S. racial dynamics? Are you using this language just to refer to intersectionality? Are you invoking the larger idea of subalternity as a type of infra-politics or cultural or even nationalist mass politics?
Okay. So the this is the textile workers wearing. Yeah. So I don't know a ton about African American organizing in the South in the earliest part, the first 2 decades of the 20th century, except that the African Blood Brotherhood is actually part of that. So the African Blood Brotherhood is the first left independent Black labor organization that emerges out of the Socialist Party of Harlem. And they blend this really interesting mix of like commitment to the international communist movement, but also, Black nationalists and decolonial politics. And they believe that organizing Black workers needed to entail both of those messages, right? And so the way that the African Blood Brotherhood was organized structurally was they had cells or posts in many different regions, not only of the United States, but also throughout the Caribbean. And so a few of their of the posts of the African Blood Brotherhood were active in organizing textile workers in the Southeast. And they were among ABB's strongest posts, actually. As I referenced during the talk, the Tulsa Post was the most famous because of the Tulsa race riots. The ABB engaged in armed defense of so-called Black Wall Street during that struggle. But I do know that at least in my book, the connection to the struggle that Bill is referring to is through the African Blood Brotherhood. With respect to Howie's question about the subaltern, is it cultural? Is it political? And what does it mean in terms of U.S. Racial dynamics? I mean, I would say that I mean it quite classically in the Gramscian sense, right? Of those of marginalized actors, and then within the context of the multiracial working class, those actors who were marginalized by white workers and the labor aristocracy. That's how I mean. That's what I mean by the subaltern. But I do want to insist that this notion of the subaltern, the way that it's, I think, been theorized in the past, is really it's problematic. Okay. Particularly in more contemporary sociology, in Du Boisian sociology, and actually post-colonial sociology as well. After the debates with the subaltern school of Indian historiography in the 1980s and 1990s, we kind of like moved away, from Spivak's warning that when we talk about the subaltern, we really need to talk about, all sorts of other actors, right? I mean, our women, for example, included in this notion of the subaltern. And so I use the subaltern, on purpose in this way, because I want to make a point, which is that I think we need to have not just a kind of variegated analysis of the subaltern. It's not only just a conversation about diversity, right? There's lots of people in the subaltern. That's not what I mean, right? What I mean is that what we call the subaltern is in fact a terrain of struggle among different actors with competing political dispositions. And actually, if I could rewrite the book today, I would include Black women as part of that field of struggle, because they actually transcend the centrist left divide, and they're advancing a distinctive political project, right? And so that's what I mean. So when I say subaltern, I mean I'm referring to that terrain of struggle.
Yes. So I have questions regarding
regarding the model minority of Asian Americans.
Oh, okay. Yeah.
And I think there's kind of a parallel structure between like Asian Americans and Black Americans where their struggle for unionism kind of thing.
Mhm.
And there's also that, at least among Chinese internet, there's that myth that the white crop unionists are among the most ardent exclusionists of Asian Americans. And also, I think based on my previous readings about like the labor history in Hawaii, there was many active union members and Communist Party members from that are of Asian American ancestry, like from Filipino, Chinese, and Japanese. So I wonder what's the relationship between the Black Americans and Asian Americans, especially in this interracial labor solidarity in like from like I think early 1900s to like 1960s.
Yes. Eventually the relationship, becomes one of multiracial solidarity, but at the very beginning, it's very contentious. So I'll just give you one example, right? So in order to break, this is not just the problem of the labor movement. This is also a tactic of capital, right? Just FYI, right? So in order to break the Brotherhood of Sleeping Car Porters, the boss used Filipino and Chinese workers to kind of, they stopped hiring African Americans and started hiring ever more Asian workers and created a kind of two-tier wage system on the railways. And Randolph and the Brotherhood were at first hostile to these new workers, and instead of organizing them, initially they wanted to exclude them. Eventually, they came around. I don't know exactly the kind of the turning point. I think that it was a gradual process in which eventually Asian members, Asians became members and then eventually became leaders on the railroads. But I would say that that was an evolving process and it was contentious at first. This is a question for me. Oh, what?
Yeah, no. So not me as the internet boy.
Yeah.
But
Okay.
I would love to know, in your view, why is the present U.S. Labor movement, and by that I mean big labor, as Armando described them, why are they either reticent or outright hostile to providing the resources and supports necessary to organize the 137 million unorganized workers here in the United States? And how does that differ, or does it differ from their reticence and hostility in the past?
Yeah.
And if impolite to talk about that in this room, we can do that.
Totally fine. Okay. The U.S. labor movement's strategy since 1936 has been integration into the state and assimilation into the Democratic Party. Mm-hmm. And the strategic objective is the following: that if we are able to gain political power for working class people, if we walk the halls of power, then we will, of necessity, increase the living standards, wages, and so forth of workers in the United States. And that is not only a failed strategy, but also an extraordinarily expensive strategy. The majority of the budgets, in some cases, the plurality, but if we're talking about organized labor, we're talking about big labor, right? The majority of those budgets are spent on political organizing, acts, electoral campaigns, right? Phone banking and door knocking, right, for Democratic candidates. So what does that mean? It means that the strategy of the labor movement is no longer mass mobilization. It is electoralism. Okay? And that means that the people who organize workers on a regular basis, including worker centers, political parties, labor educators, and unions, by the way, right? Other movement partners like the Movement for Black Lives, then those folks don't get the resources that go to Democratic candidates. If you go to there are exceptions to this rule, so I just want you to know that I know this, right? But if you go to most local unions in the United States, there might be one person whose job it is to organize new workers into the union. There might be, right? Nick and I were part of GEO Local 3550 at the University of Michigan. We represented the GSIs. There were no new organizers on our staff. We had 2 staff, and both were basically for bargaining our very mature contract, right? Rodolfo and Mark. That's it. Nobody else, right? If you go to any union in the country, it's almost always like that. Either nobody is organizing new workers into the union, or there might be one person, okay? If you could just imagine for the moment, organized labor shifting its still quite considerable resources. We're talking about hundreds of millions of dollars away from electoral politics to mass mobilization, direct action, and new organizing. Then what would happen is that unions would be predisposed to funding worker centers, immigrant rights initiatives, Movement for Black Lives partnerships, independent unions, and incentivizing existing unions that are sort of like kind of stuck in a servicing, non-movement model of unionism to organize more. But as it is, that is not the strategy of the labor movement. And that is why organized labor is reticent or hostile towards alternative labor organizations. That might, I could be wrong, but I don't think so.
I think I might be wanting to ask about an exception.
Oh, okay. Yeah, sure.
Would you say that the bargaining for the common good strategies was that kind of machine politics version, or was that different?
No, I wouldn't.
So it was a shift.
BCG, bargaining for the common good is for those who don't know, is a concept that is pioneered by many people, but I would say popularized by Stephen Lerner and Marilyn Steiderman, now currently at Georgetown and Rutgers, respectively. And but it had been practiced, on the ground in a practical, organic kind of way by other organizations before them, such as the Chicago Teachers Union. I would not say that it is the thing about bargaining for the common good is basically a shift in what workers are asking for at the table, right? Which is sort of different from what I'm talking about. But it does lead to new organizing in the sense that labor, when they're doing a bargaining for the common good campaign, they're asking for things at the table that are not just wages, working conditions, and benefits, but also things for the community. Beyond the workplace, for the community, right? Less policing, things of that nature.
Schools.
Yeah. And so the result is that there's organizing. There's new organizing in the sense that they're bringing community members who may not be formal members of the union into the labor movement. And it creates a really formidable block, particularly in local settings when, you're fighting as the mayor, right? So So that's the example that I was thinking of as an exception was is Workers United, Starbucks Workers United. Like that entire outfit is new organizing. Okay. So there are exceptions to the rule. That's more what I had in mind.
Yeah, so my question, I guess, is also kind of about the state integrationalist strategy.
Yeah.
But like, it's kind of about how much more important the state is in the economy these days, especially at the top tier of the skill ladder for workers, right? Like in a lot of these cases, like industrial unions were like a fantastic innovation labor strategy, but the craft unions and often the workers at the front of the kind of skill hierarchy, often militantly, we're among the most militant. You see that in Italy too, in the auto workers strikes where Gramsci was covering those. And so like today, the highest workers in the skill tier, especially, I mean, as a representative of graduate workers, like are often people like graduate workers or even like very highly skilled machinists or engineers. And the state has intervened so substantially in structuring the economy in the 50s, the 60s, the 70s, that like, how do you justify a full break from electoralism and the state when the state has such a massive hand in shaping the economy, especially for those kind of like higher skill tier end of workers, like with graduate workers and the healthcare and education research funding cuts for the federal government that are going on right now that are kind of devastating us.
Since we are close to time, if there are any other questions, I think we should have a lightning round so that Cedric can come back to everyone. So if you still have a question, please raise your hand. Pan, would you like to also ask a question?
I'll just try to be quick because I know this is mostly a labor group, but I found the concept of the subaltern struggle to be really interesting and generative and just really important, because what I've been working on is the Black movement. And so these moments of trans ideological solidarity around Blackness. And it just seems like, I just found it very productive to think in those terms about our own political moment as well as about the history.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you. Just writing down notes. Okay. Okay. So how do I justify a break with electoralism when the state is so kind of like integrated, so involved in structuring the economy? So I have two answers to this. One is kind of more voluntarist and another that is kind of more cautious. And I think I can hold them both together. Let's see if I can pull it off. The more voluntarist
front answer.
Yeah, the more kind of like voluntarist, like we can do it, answer actually draws upon the empirics of the Red for Ed struggle of 2018, because some of the most resounding victories happened in situations in which far right Republicans were in control of the governor's mansion and of the state legislature. And yet, in spite of their inveterate hostility, teachers and paraprofessionals were able to go on a general strike, occupational general strike in those places and push the state around. Which is not to say that the state is not involved. The state is involved. That's why they're striking the state, right? But I think that we could stand as a movement to devote more of our resources and shift our strategy, even if it is, towards pushing the state towards mass mobilization. Okay, that's one thing that I will say. The other thing is that I'm not trying to suggest, right, that the labor movement get out of politics entirely. That's just I don't. A broad front strategy would kind of that's not really sensible in a kind of broad front strategy, particularly in the midst of fascist ascendancy, right? But I think there is a difference between between the Democratic Party coming into the space as a coalition partner versus a Democratic Party that insists on their way because everybody is a captured constituency inside the Democratic Party. And, you know, what are they going to do? You know, anyway, right? There's a shift there. I don't say get out of politics. I say, can we recalibrate that and also shift resources more to mass mobilization?
So you're saying more focus on issues rather than on supporting a party. Like you can do politics by mobilizing around an issue rather than doing door-to-door canvassing for a particular party.
Yeah, I mean, I think so. I really believe that workers can push anybody around, regardless of party, right? I mean, if that were not the case, then they would not have succeeded in Arizona and West Virginia, right? So, you know, I would love for the labor movement to become more kind of politically coy, more politically independent than they are currently.